On December 26, 1991, the hammer and sickle flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union, a superpower that had survived Nazi invasion, built nuclear weapons, launched the first satellite into space, and challenged American dominance for nearly half a century, simply ceased to exist. There was no final battle, no dramatic military defeat, no revolution in the streets of Moscow. The USSR died quietly, bureaucratically, signing itself out of existence through a series of official declarations. But the cause of death was not political. It was economic. Between 1985 and 1991, the Soviet economy hemorrhaged approximately $105 billion in cumulative losses from a perfect storm of strategic miscalculations, external pressures, and structural vulnerabilities. This was not a gradual decline. This was a systematic financial strangulation executed with precision by Western intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA, working in coordination with Saudi Arabia to weaponize the one commodity the Soviet Union depended on for survival: oil. The forensic evidence of this economic warfare operation is now declassified and publicly available. The architects of the strategy, including CIA Director William Casey and officials in the Reagan administration, have openly discussed how they engineered the collapse of Soviet revenues. This was not a conspiracy theory. This was documented policy, and the mechanism was brutally simple: flood the global oil market with cheap supply, crash the price, and watch as the Soviet economy, which derived over 60% of its hard currency earnings from oil and gas exports, imploded. Let me show you exactly how they did it and why $105 billion was the kill shot that ended the Cold War not with a bang, but with an empty treasury. To understand why oil was the Soviet Union's Achilles heel, we need to examine the structure of the Soviet economy in the 1970s and early 1980s. The USSR was, at its core, a resource extraction economy dressed up as an industrial superpower. Yes, they had factories. Yes, they produced steel, machinery, and weapons. But the quality of Soviet-manufactured goods was so poor that they could not compete in international markets. Soviet cars, appliances, and electronics were jokes in the West. No one wanted to buy them. The only things the Soviet Union could sell to the world for hard currency, for dollars and deutschmarks that could be used to purchase Western technology, food, and consumer goods, were natural resources: oil, natural gas, gold, and timber. And among these, oil was king. In the 1970s, the Soviet Union became one of the world's largest oil producers, extracting approximately 11 to 12 million barrels per day at peak production. This was comparable to Saudi Arabia's output. Soviet oil was exported to Eastern European satellite states, which were forced to buy it as part of their subordination to Moscow and to Western Europe, where hard currency payments flowed directly into Soviet coffers. The revenue from these oil exports was the lifeblood of the Soviet system. It funded the military, the space program, the KGB, the subsidies that kept Eastern Europe in line, and the consumer goods imports that prevented domestic unrest. Without oil revenue, the Soviet Union could not maintain its empire. The leadership in Moscow understood this vulnerability, but they believed they had leverage. They believed that Western Europe's dependence on Soviet gas, delivered through pipelines, gave them geopolitical power. They were wrong. The vulnerability became a crisis in the mid-1980s due to a combination of internal inefficiency and external manipulation. Internally, Soviet oil production was declining. The easy-to-access oil fields in the Caucasus and the Urals were depleting. New production had to come from harsher environments in Siberia, which required advanced drilling technology, better equipment, and massive capital investment. But the Soviet economy, burdened by central planning and chronic underinvestment in anything other than the military, could not generate the productivity gains needed to offset declining output from mature fields. Production began to stagnate and then fall. By the mid-1980s, Soviet oil output was declining by approximately 1% to 2% per year. This might not sound like much, but for an economy entirely dependent on oil exports, even a small decline in production is catastrophic when combined with falling prices. And this is where the external manipulation becomes critical. In 1985, the Reagan administration, through CIA Director William Casey, initiated a covert economic warfare strategy designed to bankrupt the Soviet Union. The plan was straightforward: convince Saudi Arabia to dramatically increase oil production, flooding the global market with supply and driving prices down to levels that would make Soviet oil exports unprofitable. The Saudis had the capacity to do this. They had spare production capacity and could ramp up output relatively quickly. But why would they agree to crash the price of their own product? Because the Reagan administration offered them a deal. The U.S. would continue to provide military support and security guarantees to the Saudi regime. In exchange, the Saudis would weaponize their oil production against the Soviet Union. The operation began in late 1985. Saudi Arabia increased its oil production from approximately 2 million barrels per day to over 9 million barrels per day within a matter of months. This sudden surge in supply, combined with relatively weak global demand due to energy efficiency improvements and a recession in the early 1980s, caused oil prices to collapse. In 1980, oil had been trading at around $35 per barrel. By early 1986, the price had crashed to below $10 per barrel. This was not a market correction. This was a deliberate supply shock engineered to destroy Soviet revenues, and it worked with devastating efficiency. Let me walk you through the math to show you why this price collapse was a death sentence for the Soviet economy. At $35 per barrel, the Soviet Union, exporting approximately 4 million barrels per day to hard currency markets, was generating roughly $140 million per day in oil revenue, or approximately $51 billion per year. At $10 per barrel, that same export volume generated only $40 million per day, or approximately $14.6 billion per year. The Soviet Union lost $36.4 billion in annual oil revenue almost overnight, and this loss persisted for years. Oil prices remained depressed throughout the late 1980s, averaging between $15 and $20 per barrel. Even at $15 per barrel, the Soviets were earning only $21.9 billion per year, a loss of nearly $30 billion annually compared to the early 1980s baseline. But the $105 billion figure I cited at the beginning is not just 1 year of losses. It is the cumulative damage from 1985 to 1991, the 6-year period when oil prices remained below the level necessary to sustain Soviet fiscal stability. Let me break down the calculation conservatively. If we assume that the Soviet Union lost an average of $20 billion per year in oil revenue compared to their early 1980s baseline, multiplied by 6 years, that gives us $120 billion. But not all of this was pure loss. Some of the revenue shortfall was offset by borrowing and belt-tightening. The most credible estimates from economists who have studied Soviet finances, including scholars who gained access to Soviet archives after the collapse, place the cumulative hard currency loss at approximately $105 billion. This is the money the Soviet Union needed, but did not have. This is the fiscal gap that could not be closed. And this is the reason the Soviet state went bankrupt. To understand why $105 billion was catastrophic, we need to look at what that money was supposed to fund. The Soviet Union was not a normal economy with a diversified revenue base and the ability to borrow from international markets at reasonable rates. The Soviet state was the economy. It owned everything: the factories, the farms, the stores, the apartments. It employed everyone. It set all prices. It controlled all distribution. And it funded everything through a centralized budget. When oil revenue collapsed, the Soviet government faced an impossible choice: cut military spending, cut subsidies to the satellite states, cut consumer imports, or cut the social safety net that kept the domestic population from revolt. The problem was that cutting any of these things would trigger a cascade of failures. The military budget was untouchable. The Soviet Union defined itself as a superpower in competition with the United States. The military consumed approximately 15% to 20% of Soviet GDP, far higher than the US proportion. Cutting military spending would mean accepting strategic inferiority, abandoning allies like Cuba and Vietnam, and admitting that the USSR could no longer compete with America. The political leadership could not accept this. So the military budget remained bloated even as revenues collapsed. The subsidies to Eastern Europe were also difficult to cut. The satellite states, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, were held in the Soviet orbit through a combination of military threat and economic dependency. Moscow sold them oil and gas at below-market prices and bought their low-quality manufactured goods at above-market prices. This was a wealth transfer from the Soviet Union to Eastern Europe designed to buy loyalty and prevent rebellion. But with oil revenues collapsing, the Soviet Union could no longer afford these subsidies. The implicit deal with Eastern Europe was breaking down. Consumer imports were the third pillar. The Soviet Union could not feed its own people reliably. Soviet agriculture was chronically inefficient due to collectivization, poor incentives, and mismanagement. The USSR had to import massive quantities of grain, primarily from the United States, Canada, and Australia. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union was importing 40 to 50 million metric tons of grain per year. This grain was paid for in hard currency, dollars, which came primarily from oil exports. When oil revenues fell, the ability to purchase grain fell with it. Food shortages began to appear in Soviet cities. Bread lines grew longer. Rationing was reintroduced. This was a direct threat to social stability. The Soviet government had maintained a social contract with its people, except political repression and economic stagnation, and in return, you will have guaranteed employment, cheap housing, and basic food security. When food security disappeared, the contract was broken. The fourth pillar, the social safety net, was also under strain. The Soviet Union provided free healthcare, education, pensions, and housing. These were not generous by Western standards, but they were guaranteed. The system was funded through state revenues, which were collapsing. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Schools lacked supplies. Pensions were delayed. The population was suffering, and they knew exactly who to blame: the Communist Party and the leadership in Moscow. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was facing a full-blown fiscal crisis. The government was running massive budget deficits, printing money to cover the gaps, and triggering inflation. The ruble, which was not convertible to hard currency, was losing value even within the domestic economy. Black markets flourished. Corruption intensified. The state was losing control. But the $195 billion loss was not just about lost revenue. It was also about lost opportunity. The Soviet Union desperately needed to modernize its economy, to invest in technology, to improve productivity, and to shift away from heavy industry toward consumer goods and services. This required capital, imported technology, and access to Western expertise. But all of this cost hard currency, and the hard currency was gone, drained by the collapse of oil prices. The Soviet Union was trapped in a vicious cycle. It needed to reform its economy to become competitive, but it needed hard currency to fund those reforms. And it could not generate hard currency without a functioning, competitive economy. The $105 billion was the capital that could have been used to break this cycle. Instead, it was simply gone, extracted by the deliberate manipulation of global oil markets. The Reagan administration understood the power of this strategy. Declassified documents from the CIA and the National Security Council show that American policymakers were tracking Soviet oil revenues in real time and calibrating their strategy based on the economic pain they were inflicting. A 1985 CIA report titled "The Soviet Economy Under a New Leader" explicitly stated that falling oil prices would create severe fiscal stress for the USSR and limit their ability to compete militarily. Another NSC document from 1986 outlined how the combination of low oil prices, increased defense spending by the U.S. through the Strategic Defense Initiative, and technology embargoes would force the Soviet Union to choose between economic collapse and strategic surrender. This was economic warfare conducted with the precision of a military campaign. And it was not just oil prices. The Reagan administration also used trade restrictions and technology embargoes to choke off Soviet access to advanced equipment. The USSR desperately needed Western technology for oil drilling, computing, telecommunications, and manufacturing. The U.S. led a coordinated effort through the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, known as COCOM, to prevent Western companies from selling advanced technology to the Soviet bloc. This denied the Soviets the tools they needed to improve productivity and offset declining oil output. Every technology denial was another cut, another incremental weakening of the Soviet system. The combination of low oil prices and technology embargoes created a perfect storm of economic pressure. By 1989, the fiscal situation was catastrophic. The Soviet government was borrowing from Western banks at high interest rates just to cover basic operating expenses. The debt burden was becoming unsustainable. The satellite states in Eastern Europe, sensing Moscow's weakness, began to push for independence. Poland held semi-free elections in June 1989, leading to a non-communist government. Hungary opened its border with Austria, allowing East Germans to flee west. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution followed in December. The Soviet Union did not intervene militarily to stop these revolutions because it could not afford to. The army was underpaid, undersupplied, and demoralized. The leadership in Moscow, particularly Mikhail Gorbachev, recognized that the empire was gone. The USSR could no longer project power beyond its borders because it could barely function within them. The final collapse came in 1991. The August coup attempt by hardline communists failed, not because of popular resistance, although there was some, but because the coup leaders had no resources to sustain their action. The military and the KGB were unreliable because they had not been paid properly in months. The Soviet republics, particularly Ukraine and the Baltic states, declared independence. The central government in Moscow lost control of tax collection, making the fiscal crisis even worse. By December 1991, the Soviet Union was not just politically disintegrating. It was financially insolvent. There was no money to pay government employees, no money to fund the military, no money to buy food imports. The state was bankrupt. And on December 26th, the Supreme Soviet voted to dissolve the USSR, ending the communist superpower with a bureaucratic whimper. The $105 billion loss was not the only factor in the Soviet collapse. Internal contradictions, political repression, ethnic tensions, and the inherent inefficiencies of central planning all played roles. But money is the oxygen of any state. Without revenue, a government cannot function. Without hard currency, a resource-dependent economy cannot trade. The Soviet Union suffocated financially, and the weapon that cut off its oxygen was the deliberate manipulation of global oil prices. The Reagan administration and the CIA did not defeat the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons or conventional military force. They defeated it with economic warfare, using Saudi oil production as the weapon and $105 billion in lost revenue as the kill shot. This is not ancient history. This is a playbook. This is the template for how superpowers destroy rival states without firing a shot. And the lessons of the Soviet collapse are being studied carefully by every major power today. Russia, having lived through the devastation of the 1990s, is obsessed with energy security and hard currency reserves. China is diversifying away from dollar dependence and stockpiling commodities to avoid a similar fate. The United States, having perfected economic warfare against the USSR, continues to use sanctions, asset freezes, and market manipulation as primary tools of geopolitical strategy. The $105 billion that destroyed the Soviet Union is a reminder that in the modern world, financial power is military power, and the nation that controls the flow of money and resources controls the fate of empires. The protocol is active. In the next section, we will examine the internal structural failures that made the Soviet economy so vulnerable to external pressure, the role of Gorbachev's reforms in accelerating the collapse, and the geopolitical consequences of the USSR's disintegration that still shape the world today. The lesson is clear. Economic vulnerabilities are strategic weaknesses, and adversaries will exploit them without mercy.